It was a cold London night, the streets shrouded in darkness, every alley whispering secrets only the shadows could hear. But in one small flat, a single light burned, a dim glow behind thick curtains. A woman sat motionless in her chair, her eyes half closed, yet her mind razor-sharp. Across the room, a man stood by the window, breath held, peering through a narrow gap in the drapes. They both knew, tonight, something was going to happen. A secret was about to be exposed. And if their instincts were right, within the next few moments, either a sinister conspiracy would be unraveled, or they themselves would disappear into the darkness. Because in this city, the walls didn't just watch, they listened. The warm glow of a single lamp flickered over the modestly arranged sitting room of Agatha Marple's flat, its golden light casting elongated shadows across the orderly shelves, a time-worn armchair, and a small round table where an untouched cup of tea stood beside an intricately half-finished embroidery piece. Agatha's slender fingers moved methodically, knitting needles clicking in perfect rhythm, but her steel-grey eyes, sharp and knowing behind the delicate frames of her reading glasses, betrayed a restless intellect forever attuned to disturbances beneath the surface of ordinary life. Opposite her, Inspector Graham Doyle sat with the hesitance of a man who knew he had stepped into the presence of a mind far keener than his own. His crisp, well-pressed suit spoke of discipline, yet his fingers twitched on his knees, betraying the undercurrent of nerves that ran beneath his composed exterior. He had spent the last few minutes speaking in careful circles, expressing his admiration for Agatha's razor-sharp deductions and the privilege of discussing a case with her, before clearing his throat and finally arriving at the matter that had weighed on his mind. "Miss Marple," he began, his voice carrying the slightest quaver of uncertainty, "there is a situation I find peculiar, a flat in Montague Mansions. Nothing remarkable at first glance, but something about it doesn't sit right. A young couple, the Robinsons, managed to secure the place for a price so astoundingly low it defies logic." He leaned forward, lowering his voice as if the very walls might conspire against them. "The flat is perfectly serviceable, furnished even, in a building that, while not luxurious, is solid and respectable, and yet, the previous tenants vacated in a terrible hurry. Not once, multiple times, each time the pattern repeats. A new occupant arrives, stays a short while, then vanishes, leaving behind no explanation, only whispers of an unseen presence driving them away. No complaints of rats, no structural failings, no unscrupulous landlords, only an unspoken dread that clings to that one unit like an unshakable shadow." Agatha's knitting ceased, her fingers resting lightly on the soft bundle of yarn, the needles poised like arrows waiting to be loosed. Her gaze, when it lifted to Doyle, was unreadable, but a subtle shift in her posture revealed her intrigue. "Unspoken dread," she murmured, testing the phrase as if turning over a piece of a puzzle. "And the Robinsons, what do they make of this curious history?" Doyle exhaled, rubbing a hand over his jaw. "He's a clerk for a shipping company. She keeps the home. By all appearances, an unremarkable pair. Yet something in their eyes, especially hers, suggests they know more than they are willing to say." A silence settled between them, thick with unspoken theories, until Agatha stood with quiet precision, reaching for her hat and coat. "Montague Mansions," she said, her voice as crisp as the click of her locket fastening at her throat. "Let us see what secrets its walls have kept locked away." The building loomed against the ashen sky, its once proud stone facade, now marred by soot and rain, a weary monument to the passage of countless transient souls. Its grand brass fixtures, dulled by time and neglect, bore the fingerprints of too many tenants who had come and gone under mysterious circumstances. As Agatha and Doyle stepped through the heavy oak doors, the entry hall greeted them with the stale scent of aged wood and dust, the dim bulbs overhead, casting only half-hearted pools of light along the narrow corridor. A faded carpet, stretched along the hallway, like the ghost of former elegance, its patterns barely discernible beneath years of wear. Agatha's gaze swept over the details, the minute scuffs along the stair rail, the chipped paint on door frames, while Doyle moved with the restrained stiffness of a man unaccustomed to such surroundings. The door to the Robinsons' flat opened with an unnatural slowness, revealing a pair of hosts whose smiles held an edge of something unsaid. Mrs. Robinson, a slight woman with auburn curls pinned with meticulous care, stepped back to allow them inside, but her fingers trembled slightly as she smoothed her skirt. Robinson, taller, his shoulders stiff with an almost imperceptible tension, lingered by the threshold a moment too long before following them in. The air within the flat carried something intangible, an absence, a weight that pressed against the senses like the hush before a storm. Agatha stepped forward, taking in every detail of the space, the untouched layer of dust on the far bookshelf, the inexplicable draft that seemed to whisper from nowhere, and above all, the feeling, undeniable and electric, that they were being watched. And they were not alone. A nervous energy clung to Mr. Robinson, making him appear younger than his years as he hovered near the doorway, his fingers unconsciously tightening around the edges of his waistcoat. "Thank you for coming," Mrs. Robinson said, her voice gentle, polished with an air of practiced politeness. "I hope you don't mind the state of things, we've only just settled in." Yet Agatha Marple, standing with quiet elegance near the fireplace, noted that the flat bore no signs of a home recently inhabited. The furnishings, though modest, were of fine quality: comfortable armchairs upholstered in sturdy but well-worn fabric, a small sideboard with an aging veneer, and heavy drapes framing a large window that, despite its size, allowed in only a muted sallow light. But beneath this carefully arranged normalcy, subtle incongruities lingered, a patch of wallpaper slightly mismatched, a single chair in the far corner that looked untouched, as if it had belonged to another time, another life. Doyle, ever the diplomat, removed his hat and offered a reassuring nod. "You've done a fine job making it your own," he remarked, his tone light yet measured, his eyes flicking toward Agatha, who stood motionless, studying the mantelpiece with an intensity that suggested she had already begun to peel back the layers of illusion. "Oh, thank you," Mrs. Robinson replied, her smile growing just a fraction more genuine. "Though really we have the landlord to thank. He was so kind, offering us the flat at such a reasonable rate. We could hardly believe it." Doyle's expression barely shifted, but there was a sharpness in his gaze now. "And why was it so reasonable, if you don't mind me asking?" His voice was casual, but Agatha heard the weight behind the words, the careful probing of a man who already suspected the answer. Mr. Robinson hesitated, his glance shifting momentarily to his wife, who spoke first. "He said it had been empty for some time," she admitted, a delicate pause between her words. "Most people found the location inconvenient. There were minor cosmetic issues, he mentioned, but honestly, we've found it quite comfortable. We feel lucky, really." "Indeed," Agatha murmured, her voice slicing through the air like a well-honed blade. Her hands, gloved and precise, clasped before her as she turned slightly toward the far wall. "A most fortunate find in a city where rents are often, shall we say, less than accommodating." Mr. Robinson chuckled, though the sound was thin, almost forced. "Yes, absolutely. We couldn't have asked for more." Agatha's expression did not change, but something in her posture shifted ever so slightly. "I don't suppose you've done much decorating yet?" she asked, her tone light, almost absent-minded. Mrs. Robinson shook her head, too quickly. "Not yet. We're still sorting through boxes, trying to get everything in order." "Of course," Agatha murmured, but her eyes had already moved past Mrs. Robinson, past the well-placed furniture and the careful arrangements, settling instead on the faint impressions along the wallpaper, evidence of something larger that had once stood there, since removed. An absence more pronounced than any presence. She turned back to Doyle, her voice neutral, yet laced with meaning. "Inspector, perhaps we might take a look around the building after our visit here. I find it always helps to understand the full surroundings." Doyle, sharp enough to catch the unspoken implications, nodded. "That sounds like a fine idea." As the conversation shifted to lighter topics, Agatha remained composed, her observations stored away for later scrutiny. The Robinsons' story was plausible, their demeanor polite, their nervousness understandable, and yet, as she swept another glance around the room, catching the faint scent of varnish lingering beneath the more welcoming aroma of fresh tea, the indentation on the carpet, where something weighty had been recently dragged away, and the way the heavy drapes seemed to billow slightly, despite the windows being firmly shut, she knew without a doubt that this flat, so modest, so conveniently affordable, held secrets. Not just the kind whispered among former tenants, but the kind that left an imprint so deep it could never truly be erased. And for all their politeness, for all their insistence on their good fortune, the Robinsons knew it too. They were afraid. And for the first time in a long while, Agatha Marple felt the distinct, unmistakable thrill of a mystery worthy of her attention. Agatha Marple's gloved fingers trailed absently over the back of the chair before she crouched, her hand adjusting the hem of her stocking in a seemingly effortless gesture. In reality, her sharp eyes swept the floorboards, taking in the faint scuff marks, marks that suggested a heavy piece of furniture had been dragged away recently, subtle but undeniable. As she straightened, she allowed her gaze to wander over the room, lingering on the baseboards where fresh paint had been applied hastily, uneven strokes betraying a rushed attempt to conceal rather than restore. Even the door hinges bore tiny flecks of white, as though someone had painted over them in a hurry, unconcerned with the finish. Mrs. Robinson stood near the sideboard, her hands smoothing down her apron with nervous energy. "I hope it's not too drafty in here," she said, her voice just a touch too light, too casual. "We've had a bit of trouble with the windows sticking." Agatha offered her a smile, one that did not quite reach her eyes. "Oh, not at all. It's a charming flat. Quite charming." She let the words settle, then moved toward the bookshelves flanking the fireplace, fingers drifting idly over the spines of neatly arranged volumes. A curious thing, how orderly they were, except for one shelf lower down, where the dust had been disturbed, not by hands, but by something removed in haste. Her fingers hovered, then with the practiced ease of one well acquainted with discretion, plucked a small slip of paper, barely peeking from behind a book's edge. Without pause, she tucked it into her handbag, the movement fluid, unnoticed. "You must be quite pleased with the location," Agatha remarked, turning back to Mrs. Robinson, her tone pleasant, conversational. "And it must be a relief to have found such a beautifully furnished flat, for so little cost." For the briefest moment, something flickered across Mr. Robinson's face, a faltering of the carefully maintained composure. "Yes, it was quite a surprise," he said, forcing a chuckle. "We thought it might be too good to be true, but the landlord assured us the rent was low, only because the place needed some freshening up." "Freshening up," Agatha repeated softly, almost to herself, her gaze flicked once more toward the doorframe, toward the uneven strokes of paint. "How fortunate, you've managed so well." Mrs. Robinson's hands fidgeted with the strings of her apron. "Yes, though we've been careful not to disturb anything too much. We wouldn't want to give the landlord any reason to regret the bargain." Agatha inclined her head, the warmth of her smile carefully measured. "Very considerate of you." She turned slightly, catching the eye of Inspector Doyle, who had been standing near the window, his posture at ease, but his gaze watchful. "I think we've seen quite enough for now, wouldn't you agree, Inspector?" Doyle hesitated, then gave a slow nod. "Yes, indeed." The Robinsons escorted them to the door, their smiles lingering, but the tension beneath their expressions had begun to fray. They knew something they weren't saying. Agatha held her silence, but as they stepped into the hallway and the door closed behind them, She finally spoke in a low, measured tone. "There's more to this story, Inspector. Much more." Later, in the warm glow of her sitting room, the fire crackling in the hearth, Agatha Marple sat in quiet contemplation. The rhythmic click of her knitting needles filled the space, punctuated only by the occasional scratch of Doyle's pencil as he scribbled notes in his worn leather notebook. Between them, resting on the side table, was the slip of paper, dull, yellowed with age, its edges torn unevenly. Agatha set aside her knitting, picking up the scrap with a deliberate slowness. The ink, though faded, was still legible, a series of letters and numbers arranged in short, irregular rows. She turned it over, examining the blank reverse before setting it down once more. "It does rather look like a code, doesn't it?" she mused. Doyle exhaled, his eyes fixed on the cryptic markings. "Definitely not a shopping list, that's for certain." A faint smile touched her lips. "No, not a shopping list, but if it is a code, one has to wonder why it was hidden beneath a bookshelf." Doyle leaned forward, pencil poised. Could be a message left by someone who lived there before, or something more recent. Either way, one thing is clear. He met Agatha's gaze, his voice dropping into a murmur. That flat wasn't just a flat. Agatha turned back toward the fire, watching the flames dance as she turned the thought over in her mind. "No," she agreed, fingers tapping absently against the arm of her chair. "It might be something much, much more." Inspector Graves adjusted the collar of his coat with a faint smile, as Amelia Thornton cast a watchful glance around the room, a small, old yet well-furnished space, where everything seemed perfectly in place, yet an unspoken unease lingered in the air, as if something unseen was observing them, as if the room itself was hiding its true nature. "Thank you for coming," Evelyn Carter said, offering a polite smile, but a subtle tightness in her voice betrayed a concealed tension. "I hope you find this place to your liking." "Quite charming, very comfortable," Graves remarked casually, yet his eyes scanned every detail with sharp precision. The thin layer of fresh paint hastily applied over the door frames, the faint drag marks on the floor, suggesting that a heavy object had recently been moved, and most peculiar of all, the bookshelf, seemingly untouched. Yet when Amelia ran a careful finger across it, the dust was uneven, as if someone had disturbed it just moments ago. Evelyn's eyes flickered with an unreadable expression, her composure held firm, yet there was something guarded in her demeanor. "Much appreciated," she said, though the way she spoke hinted at someone concealing a truth, rather than extending mere hospitality. Amelia took another slow look around. There near the doorframe, a barely visible line in the woodwork, as if a section of the wall had been tampered with. "Was it an easy decision to move in?" Graves asked, his tone light-hearted, yet laced with unspoken intent. Evelyn inhaled sharply before responding. "Yes, the place is wonderful, and the rent is quite reasonable, and—" Amelia pressed her sharp gaze unwavering. Evelyn's smile faltered just for a fraction of a second before she steadied herself. "Well, it's an old place, and it was unoccupied for quite some time before we arrived." Her voice was neither a blatant lie, nor the complete truth. "Interesting," Graves murmured with an amused glint in his eye, though his mind was already racing ahead. He stepped closer to the bookshelf, and rapped his knuckles against the wood. An unusual hollow echo vibrated through the silence, as though something unseen lay concealed within. Amelia's gaze met Evelyn's, whose hands were now twisting nervously in front of her. A heavy silence settled over the room, thick with the weight of an unspoken past, as if the very walls bore witness to something long forgotten. "I believe, Inspector," Amelia said softly, her voice measured, "that this is not just an ordinary flat, it's something more." Graves gave a slight nod, while for the briefest moment, a flicker of apprehension crossed Evelyn's eyes before vanishing into well-rehearsed composure. This was no longer just about an old apartment, it was about a secret woven into its walls, a past waiting to be unearthed, and a truth lurking just beneath the surface. The mystery was no longer a matter of speculation, it was merely waiting for the right question to bring it into the light. The soft hum of a flickering street lamp bathed the damp pavement in an eerie glow, its feeble light barely piercing the dense London fog that curled through the alleyways like ghostly fingers. Inspector Calloway adjusted the brim of his hat, his sharp gaze never wavering from the townhouse across the street, ordinary to the untrained eye, but to him it was a puzzle waiting to be unraveled, a facade, whispering of secrets buried beneath its aging walls. The gaslight in the cafe's window cast a dim reflection on Evelyn Hargrove's face as she swirled the last of her untouched tea, her expression unreadable, but her mind razor-sharp. "People reveal more in their movements than their words," she murmured, her fingers tracing absent patterns on the tabletop. A nervous pause before stepping inside, a glance cast over the shoulder, a hand gripping a parcel too tightly. "Watch Calloway, and they will tell us everything we need to know." The inspector merely nodded, his pencil poised above his notebook as the night stretched long and silent, the distant chime of a clock, striking midnight, breaking the stillness like a whisper of warning. Then, as if summoned by the hour itself, the first figure emerged, a gaunt man in a dark overcoat, his collar turned high against the chill, his hands buried deep in his pockets. He moved swiftly, his steps measured, his head turning slightly, as if expecting a shadow at his heels. The door to the townhouse opened just before he reached it. No knock, no hesitation. Just a brief sliver of golden candlelight spilling onto the street, before the darkness swallowed him whole. Calloway exhaled slowly. "He's not the first," Evelyn said softly, her gaze fixed on the entrance. "And he won't be the last." She was right. Minutes later, another figure emerged from the mist, a woman small in stature, her coat wrapped tightly around her frame, her grip on a nondescript brown parcel, almost desperate. Unlike the first, she hesitated at the threshold, her breath visible in the cold air as if she was steeling herself before stepping inside. The door closed behind her, the moment sealed in silence. Then another figure came, and another. The sequence played out like a silent performance, rehearsed, deliberate, never two at once, never a second too soon. Each arrival stayed for a precise amount of time before slipping back into the night, lighter than when they had entered. Calloway's brow furrowed. "They bring something in," he murmured, glancing at his notebook, "but they never take anything out." Evelyn's lips curled into the faintest hint of a smile. "Precisely, something is being collected." A gust of wind sent the gaslight in the cafe's window flickering violently, and Calloway shifted in his seat, his muscles tense with the weight of realization. This wasn't a simple exchange of hands, it was a gathering, a slow and methodical accumulation of something unseen, something meant to remain within those walls. Then, at precisely 1:30, the rhythm changed. A tall, broad-shouldered man appeared from the far end of the street, his steps deliberate, his presence commanding. He carried nothing, yet when he reached the townhouse, the door did not open immediately. Instead, there was a pause, a hesitation just long enough to be deliberate. And then, a silhouette appeared in the dim glow behind the glass, a figure standing still, watching. Calloway's breath hitched. This wasn't just a meeting place, this was a gatekeeper's domain, and whatever was being gathered inside that townhouse, it was no longer merely an exchange of objects. It was something more, something unseen, something waiting, and the real question was, waiting for what? The heavy silence of the night wrapped around the city like a shroud, broken only by the distant chime of a clock striking 2. Inspector Holloway eased back into the worn leather chair of the dimly lit cafe, its once polished wooden tables, now dulled by time and countless forgotten conversations. Through the fogged glass, his gaze remained fixed on the looming silhouette of Blackmere House, a seemingly unremarkable townhouse, nestled between two taller buildings on a narrow gaslit street. The passers-by, sparse at this hour, barely spared it a glance, but Holloway had learned that the most dangerous secrets were often hidden in plain sight. Across from him, Evelyn Dane methodically folded a slip of paper between her fingers, her expression impassive, yet her dark eyes glimmered with sharp calculation. "They come, they go, but none stay," she murmured, her voice carrying the weight of certainty. "Not one lingers like a tenant, not one acts as though they belong." Holloway nodded, flipping open his notebook, its pages already filled with sketches, hurried observations, and precise time-stamps. He had watched them all, the pale man in a navy coat, the woman in the green cloche hat, the stocky figure who always carried a bundle under his arm. Each arrived separately, slipping through the townhouse door as if stepping into another world, only to emerge minutes later, hands now empty, eyes darting, movements brisk. "Not a single parcel taken out," he muttered, "only delivered." "A drop point," Evelyn stated, tapping a finger against the tabletop, "deliberate, controlled. But for what purpose?" The question hung in the air like the last exhale of a dying candle. Outside, the mist thickened, curling in the dim glow of the street lamps, turning the edges of the buildings into shifting shadows. A cab clattered past, hooves echoing against the damp cobblestones, but Holloway barely noticed. His attention was drawn to a new arrival. A tall figure emerged from the fog, his long coat fluttering slightly in the breeze. Unlike the others, this man paused. His posture was confident, calculated. This was no ordinary courier. He removed his hat slowly, surveying the street with a careful, deliberate gaze before stepping forward. The door to Blackmere House creaked open just as he reached it. This time, however, he did not enter immediately. Instead, a shape appeared behind the glass, a silhouette unmoving, watching. "They're waiting for something," Holloway breathed. Evelyn's grip tightened around her teacup. "Or someone." The door remained ajar for a fraction too long, before the man stepped inside, the entrance sealing behind him with an ominous finality. Evelyn exhaled, setting the folded paper down between them. That, she said softly, was not routine. The clock on the wall ticked steadily, its rhythmic counting of time suddenly deafening in the hush that followed. Across the street, Blackmere House stood as it always had, silent, unobtrusive, its darkened windows betraying nothing. And yet, the sense of unease had deepened. Something had shifted. Holloway's pencil hovered over the notebook, but he hesitated. The night had given them patterns, movement, purpose, but not answers. Not yet. But as his gaze drifted back to the shadowed doorway, a single thought settled in his mind with cold certainty. Whatever lay behind those walls, it was not meant to be seen. The damp weight of the London fog pressed against the streets, swallowing the distant echoes of carriage wheels and muffling the footsteps of those who moved through the night with purpose. From the shadows of a dimly lit cafe, Inspector Calloway watched the entrance of Langley House, his fingers idly drumming against the leather-bound notebook resting on the table before him. Across from him, Eliza Thorne stirred her tea with deliberate slowness, her sharp gaze never straying far from the street beyond the misted windowpane. "They treat that flat as if it were a stage," she murmured. "Each one enters, plays their part, and exits before the curtain has time to fall." Calloway leaned forward. "Except we don't know the play, or its purpose." Eliza's lips curved into a knowing smile. "Not yet." The bell above the cafe door chimed, and Calloway barely turned his head as a figure in a dark coat stepped inside, shaking off the chill of the night. He recognized him immediately. Robert Vance, a man with an air of studied indifference but eyes that missed nothing. Vance didn't sit. Instead, he paused by the counter, exchanged a quiet word with the barista, and slipped a folded slip of paper into the pocket of the man seated nearest the door before vanishing back into the night. "You saw that," Calloway murmured. "Naturally," Eliza replied, taking an unhurried sip of her tea. "And you heard what the barista said just before he left." "Something about a shipment." Calloway exhaled slowly, his mind working through the pieces like a chessboard, shifting under unseen hands. "They're preparing for something." "More than that," Eliza corrected. setting down her cup. "They're ensuring that flat is ready, which means something is coming, and soon." The gas lights flickered outside, their glow barely cutting through the fog that had thickened around the silhouette of Langley House. Calloway closed his notebook with a decisive snap. "Then we need to be ready before they are." They moved with practiced ease through the maze of narrow streets, their steps swallowed by the hush of midnight. The townhouse loomed ahead, its windows dark, its door an unassuming threshold concealing something far more deliberate than mere lodgers. A man emerged from the mist, his coat collar turned up, his gait precise. He paused for the barest fraction of a second before mounting the steps. A knock? No. Too brief, too calculated. This was a signal. The door opened almost instantly, the exchange so seamless that had Calloway blinked, he might have missed it. "He's inside," Eliza murmured. They waited, the seconds stretching, the silence growing heavier, and then movement. The door opened once more, and the man stepped out, his coat sitting differently, his pocket weighted with something newly acquired, not a message. Something tangible. Calloway's pulse quickened. "We follow." The night swallowed them as they moved in the man's wake, their presence masked by the city's own restless quiet. He walked with purpose, winding through alleyways and deserted avenues, the air tinged with the briny scent of the Thames. The dockyards loomed ahead, their skeletal cranes and towering warehouses standing sentinel over the unseen dealings of the underworld. He wasn't alone. Another figure stepped from the gloom, their silent greeting exchanged in a mere glance. A package was passed. Quick, unremarkable, forgettable to any casual observer, but Calloway knew better. This was not a simple delivery. This was an operation coordinated, precise and hidden beneath the city's oblivious gaze. And tonight, it had finally been seen. The mist clung to the dockyard like a living thing, curling around the hulking forms of warehouses and lapping at the cobbled streets with an eerie stillness. Eliza Thorne pressed herself into the shadow of a stacked crate, her sharp eyes tracking the two figures standing beneath the dim flicker of a gas lamp. They exchanged no words, no gestures of camaraderie, just a brief nod before the parcel changed hands. A small, neatly wrapped package, unremarkable save for the tension with which it was received. Not fragile, not delicate, but important. Inspector Calloway, crouched a step behind Eliza, exhaled slowly. Something significant. Eliza's lips barely moved. "Wait." Her voice was a whisper, barely carried by the damp night air. The second man, the recipient, melted into the fog, his footsteps absorbed by the hush of the midnight docks. The first turned on his heel and retraced his steps, moving with practiced ease. Eliza exchanged a glance with Calloway. The moment had passed, but its implications loomed large. This was no common errand. The trade had been precise, measured, another stroke in a picture still half hidden. A faint tang of salt and damp wood lingered in the cold air as Eliza's gaze returned to the retreating figure. The parcel, small, unassuming, bore a mark, a faint emblem inked onto the paper, nearly lost in the dim glow of the lantern, a crescent with a single dot. Calloway shifted beside her, catching the briefest glimpse. "That symbol, it matches the cipher from the note," Eliza finished, her voice thoughtful, but sure. "This isn't just an exchange, it's a message." Calloway's brow furrowed, and the flat, connected, she confirmed, her mind moving with quiet efficiency. That address was never chosen at random. It's not a simple lodging, it's a point of transfer, a link in a chain. "A smuggling operation?" Calloway asked, his gaze lingering on the disappearing silhouette. "Or worse," Eliza murmured. "Secrets are far more valuable than stolen goods." Calloway straightened slightly, his instincts urging action. "Should we intercept him?" "Not yet," she said, her tone firm. "If we stop him now, we risk losing the trail. We need to see the full picture before we reveal our hand." The fog swallowed the last traces of their quarry, and the moment settled into a hush once more. Eliza stood, brushing dust from her coat. "We have enough for tonight. Let's go." The warm glow of the fire flickered against the walls of Eliza's study, its crackling a stark contrast to the silence between them. Calloway flipped through his notebook, his mind fitting the night's events together like a puzzle with missing edges. Eliza moved with careful precision, setting the kettle to boil, her thoughts working through the same tangled web. "That flat," she said at last, her voice steady but edged with certainty. "It was never meant to be rented cheaply out of kindness. It was a trap." Calloway looked up. "A trap. A carefully laid one," she clarified, pouring tea with unhurried ease. "Someone needed it occupied. Not because it was difficult to let, but because having seemingly ordinary tenants kept it from drawing attention." Calloway's fingers tightened around his notebook. "You're saying the residents were chosen, not for their benefit," Eliza said, her lips curving faintly, "but because their presence made the flat invisible." The fire crackled, shadows shifting across the study walls as Calloway absorbed the weight of her words. "And the people behind it. That," she said, taking a measured sip of tea, "is our next question." But one thing was clear now. The flat was no simple lodging, it was a crossroads of something far larger. And as the puzzle pieces aligned, the true shape of the mystery began to emerge from the shadows. The soft chime of porcelain against wood was the only sound in the dimly lit sitting room as Eliza Thorne set down her tea, her gaze distant, thoughts assembling themselves like pieces of a puzzle. "They know more than they realize," she murmured at last, her voice calm but weighted. "Whether they are complicit or merely caught in the web is yet to be determined, but either way, we tread carefully. They may be deeper in this than even they suspect." Across from her, Inspector Calloway watched in silence, sensing the gears of her mind turning, aligning the night's discoveries into something resembling order. He had long since learned that when the moment came, Eliza would see the truth more clearly than anyone else. The first fingers of dawn stretched across the sky as Montague House loomed before them, its grand past reduced to a soot-darkened relic, its windows dull with neglect. The building seemed to hold its breath, as if aware that something unnatural had taken root within its walls. Eliza adjusted her gloves, tilting her head slightly, as if listening to something beyond human hearing. Beside her, Calloway straightened his coat, squared his shoulders. Without a word, they climbed the stone steps, boots heavy on damp stone, and rapped their knuckles against the faded wood of apartment 4. A moment later, the door creaked open. Arthur Robinson stood there, his face pale, his tie loosened as if sleep had evaded him. His fingers fidgeted at his sides. Behind him, Margaret Robinson hovered in the doorway, her auburn hair pinned hastily back, her eyes rimmed with exhaustion. "Miss Thorne," she said, in a thin voice, glancing toward the inspector. "We weren't expecting visitors so early." Eliza offered a faint, polite smile, just enough to reassure but not to comfort. "I do apologize for the intrusion, but I'm afraid this matter can't wait." The couple exchanged a nervous glance before stepping aside. The flat was immaculate. Not a book out of place, not a speck of dust visible, but the air was thick, almost oppressive. Something unseen coiled in the corners, a presence that did not belong. Eliza moved toward the modest fireplace, folding her hands in her lap, as Calloway remained standing, notebook at the ready. "I will come straight to the point," she began, her voice smooth but unwavering. "There have been unusual occurrences here at Montague House. Strange visitors at odd hours, parcels exchanged in secrecy. I trust you've noticed." Margaret hesitated, her hands twisted together as she cast a glance at her husband. "We've seen people coming and going, yes, but we thought they were neighbors. Or deliveries, perhaps." Calloway's voice cut through the quiet, calm but edged with authority. "And the note, hidden beneath your bookshelf." Arthur's face drained of color. "Note? What note?" Without a word, Eliza reached into her handbag and withdrew a slip of paper. Carefully she unfolded it, revealing a ciphered message. lines of symbols marked in ink. She let the silence stretch just long enough. It was concealed here, in your home. I assume you have no idea how it got there. Margaret's hand flew to her mouth. We've never seen that before, I swear. Calloway studied their faces, his pencil hovering above the page. No idea who might have left it. We don't. Arthur's voice cracked. We've been trying to stay out of whatever's going on, ever since. He stopped abruptly. Eliza did not blink. Ever since. Margaret spoke quickly. Ever since we moved in, it's been strange. From the beginning, the landlord offered the flat at a price too good to be true, and when we asked why, he only smiled. Then the footsteps in the halls at night. The whispers, we didn't know what to do, so we just kept our heads down. Eliza's gaze sharpened. You were frightened. Margaret's breath hitched. We thought if we ignored it, it would stop, that maybe we'd imagined things. Eliza and Calloway exchanged a glance. The Robinsons' fear felt real. Their bewilderment was not an act. Yet something did not align. The ciphered note, the curiously timed tenancy, the landlord's evasiveness, these were not coincidences. Eliza's voice was soft but firm as she spoke again. You weren't just tenants, you were placed here. The fire crackled in the hush that followed, and the trap, once hidden, had begun to reveal its teeth. Eliza Thorne watched the Robinsons in silence, her gaze steady but unreadable. I must ask you to be honest, she said at last, her voice gentle yet firm. If there is anything at all, that you have not told us, now is the time. The couple exchanged a glance, their faces pale but earnest. We've told you everything, Margaret Robinson pleaded, her voice trembling. Please, you must believe us. Eliza studied them a moment longer, then slowly rose from her chair, smoothing the fabric of her gloves. Thank you for your time. She met Inspector Calloway's gaze as they stepped into the dimly lit corridor, the door clicking shut behind them with a finality that sent a whisper of unease through the air. The silence of Montague House wrapped around them like a held breath, broken only by the distant hum of the city beyond its walls. Doyle's eyes flicked upward, his brow furrowing. They're afraid, he muttered, not just of of something more. Eliza nodded, adjusting the lace at her wrist. Fear has many faces, she murmured. Not all of them belong to the guilty. They descended the staircase in measured steps, their footsteps muffled against the faded carpet runner. As they reached the landing, Calloway stopped abruptly, his sharp gaze locking onto a shadow at the upper window. A figure, a fleeting silhouette, stood just beyond the curtain, withdrawing the moment they were seen. The fabric fluttered back into place, as if it had never moved at all. Doyle's jaw tensed. We're being watched, he murmured. Eliza did not break stride. Good, she said simply, her voice untouched by surprise. That means we're on the right path. Doyle caught up with her as they stepped out onto the fog-draped street, the lamplight casting long spectral shadows on the cobbled pavement. Smugglers' coded messages, silent witnesses. I can't help but feel we're in deeper than we anticipated, he admitted, the damp night air clinging to his coat. Eliza's lips barely curved in response. It likely goes far deeper, she said, her tone unshaken. But that's precisely why we must press forward. The truth is always just beyond the point of comfort. That evening Doyle sat in the dim hush of the station poring over a brittle yellowed file, its pages curling at the edges. The scent of ink and aging paper clung to the air as he flipped through records, his pencil tapping against the desk in rhythmic thought. Then he saw it, Montague House, apartment 3B. The name scrawled beside it made his pulse hitch. James Blackjack Harford. The name was legend in certain circles, a smuggler whose network had run like an underground vein through London's shadows, slipping illicit goods through unseen cracks in the law. 6 years ago he had disappeared. Some said he fled, some said he was buried beneath the very streets he once ruled. But one thing was certain, his name still carried weight in whispers. Doyle's mind raced. If Montague House had been a hub before, could it still be? Perhaps not under Harford's hand, but another's. The turnover of tenants, the suspiciously cheap rent, the visitors who came and went under the cover of darkness, it fit too neatly to ignore. He scribbled a note in his ledger and stood swiftly, reaching for his coat. Eliza needed to see this. As he stepped into the night, the fog curled thickly in the alleyways, dampening the distant clip of hooves on cobblestone. The shadows pressed in closer than before, their weight almost sentient. Doyle's pulse thrummed as he quickened his pace. The deeper they dug, the higher the stakes seemed to climb. Somewhere within the heart of Montague House, something waited, watching. And as Doyle reached Eliza's door, he knew whatever they had just uncovered was only the beginning. The narrow flat was shrouded in shadows, its furniture arranged with a purpose that prioritized secrecy over comfort. A single standing lamp cast a feeble glow over the threadbare carpet, its light barely stretching to the edges of the dimly lit room. Eliza Thorne sat rigidly on the edge of the armchair, her figure stark against the weak luminescence, her fingers drumming softly against the wooden armrest. Across from her, Doyle stood by the window, peering through the slit between the curtains, his breath shallow as he scanned the street below. They had spent weeks chasing whispers, following fragments of a trail that had led them here to this precise moment. Tonight they would have their proof. Minutes stretched into hours, the night growing heavy with a silence broken only by the distant clang of a tram and the restless sigh of wind through the narrow alleyways. Below them the Robinsons' flat remained eerily still, its windows dark, its occupants either absent or hiding. Every so often, Doyle flicked his gaze toward Eliza. She had not moved, though he knew her mind was a churning storm beneath her composed exterior. Then at last, a sound, the soft, deliberate crunch of footsteps on gravel. Doyle tensed, his fingers tightening around the curtain's edge. "Someone's coming," he murmured. Eliza's voice was smooth, unwavering. "Just as expected. Stay patient." From their vantage point they watched two shadowy figures slip into view, their movements quick, calculated. The shorter one cradled a small, unmarked case against his chest, while the taller figure scanned their surroundings before retrieving a key from his coat. The door clicked open, and in one fluid motion they vanished inside. Doyle exhaled sharply, already reaching for the revolver at his hip. "Now," Eliza whispered. Doyle flicked off the lamp, plunging the flat into near-total darkness. The only illumination came from the street below, thin slivers of light filtering through the window, stretching long, ghostly fingers across the wooden floor. They moved swiftly, soundlessly, slipping out of their hiding place and down the stairs. As they reached the Robinsons' door, Doyle noticed the faintest gap in the entrance. It had not been fully shut. From within, hushed voices clashed in low urgency, papers rustling, objects shifting. Eliza raised a hand. "Wait." With excruciating slowness, she pushed the door open. The hinges barely creaked. The two men inside were so engrossed in their task that they did not notice until it was too late. The taller figure turned sharply, his face partially obscured by a scarf, his hand diving for something inside his coat. Doyle was faster. In a heartbeat, he had the man's arm twisted behind his back, forcing him to the ground with a practiced motion. The shorter intruder stumbled back, the case slipping from his grasp. Its contents spilled across the floor, documents emblazoned with official seals, intricate diagrams marked with military insignias, coded messages scrawled in a hurried, unfamiliar hand. Stolen intelligence. Eliza moved with calculated precision, reaching for the light switch, but instead of flicking it on, she snapped it off. The room was swallowed in darkness. For a fraction of a second, there was only confusion, then the scuffle resumed in the blind haze. Doyle wrestled his captive, a sharp cry of pain escaping the man's lips as he struggled. The second intruder lunged toward the scattered documents, but Eliza was faster. Her fingers closed around his wrist, twisting it at just the right angle to make him falter. He gasped, half collapsing against the desk, his resistance breaking as she forced him back. The struggle was brief but brutal. By the time Doyle managed to pin his opponent to the ground, and Eliza subdued the second, silence had reclaimed the flat. The two men lay sprawled, panting, their escape routes cut off. The documents remained strewn across the floor, a stark testament to the gravity of what they had just uncovered. This was no mere smuggling ring. This was something far more dangerous. Doyle wiped a sleeve across his brow, his pulse still hammering. "I suppose this means we're in deeper than we thought," he muttered. Eliza exhaled, surveying the fallen men, the damning evidence. Her lips barely curled in satisfaction. "Oh, Calloway," she murmured, retrieving a single paper from the pile, the ink still fresh. "We've only just begun." Doyle stood over the subdued men, their scarves discarded, revealing faces marked by a lifetime of deception and crime. Eliza Thorne surveyed the scattered documents with an expression that was both measured and unyielding. She bent down, her gloved fingers brushing over the classified papers, their crisp edges illuminated by the dim morning light seeping through the cracked blinds. "These will be returned to the proper authorities," she said, her voice carrying the weight of finality. The taller man scowled, his jaw tightening, but the shorter one, perhaps realizing the futility of resistance, remained silent. Doyle hauled him to his feet with a firm grip, his tone edged with authority. "You'd do well to reconsider your choices. This operation won't last much longer. We'll see to that." As the intruders were led away, Eliza methodically gathered the documents, treating them not just as evidence, but as dangerous remnants of a larger unseen puzzle. The room fell silent, save for the soft rustle of paper and the groaning protest of the old floorboards beneath her feet. When she straightened, her gaze met Doyle's. "This isn't the end," she murmured, her expression unreadable. "It's only the beginning." The morning after the raid, the city awoke from its shroud of secrecy. The dense fog that had draped Montague Mansions the previous night had dissipated, leaving behind its stark brick facade bathed in an anemic morning glow. But inside, the air still hummed with the weight of unsolved mysteries. Inspector Doyle sat in Eliza's sitting room, his fingers idly tracing the rim of his teacup as he reviewed the case notes. He had spent the early hours briefing the authorities, ensuring the stolen intelligence was secured and the two captured spies delivered to the proper hands. Now, as Eliza entered, removing her gloves with the same composed precision she applied to everything, Doyle exhaled through his nose and shook his head. "Spies, Eliza," he muttered. "In Montague Mansions, and here I thought I was dealing with nothing more than a blackmailing landlord." Eliza poured herself a cup of tea, her expression betraying neither amusement nor surprise. "Appearances, Doyle," she said, settling into her chair, "are only as honest as we choose to believe them." She took a measured sip, her gaze distant yet razor-sharp. That particular flat was always more than it seemed. A transient space, convenient, overlooked. A perfect point of exchange for those who prefer to operate in the shadows. Doyle, pencil hovering over his notebook, frowned. "And the Robinsons?" he asked. They seemed like any ordinary frightened tenants. Just a family caught in the crossfire. Were they truly oblivious? Eliza set her cup down with a quiet clink. "Not quite," she said smoothly. "I visited them before returning home. They had rather interesting things to confess." Doyle's gaze sharpened. "Confess?" Eliza leaned forward slightly, her voice lowering as if the very walls could eavesdrop. "The Robinsons were not as naive as they appeared. In fact, they were never truly at risk." Doyle's brow furrowed. "You mean, they weren't victims?" They were sent by an undisclosed government office. Their task was to observe, to track the movement of stolen intelligence, and if the opportunity presented itself, to reclaim it without drawing attention. Doyle blinked, his pencil frozen mid-word. "You're telling me they knew all along?" Eliza's lips cuddled ever so slightly. They suspected. They played their part well. Fear, confusion, it was all carefully performed to keep the real spies from suspecting them. She exhaled a flicker of something unreadable in her expression. This was never just about stolen documents. It was about testing the boundaries of deception itself. Doyle leaned back, the weight of realization settling over him. The Robinsons had been planted. The enemy had been deceived, and yet the real question remained. If the Robinsons had been watching the spies, then who had been watching the Robinsons? Doyle stared at the flickering embers in the hearth, his thoughts tangled in the revelations of the night. Across from him, Eliza Thorne sat poised, her gloved fingers resting lightly on the arm of her chair, her gaze calm yet unreadable. The weight of deception still lingered in the air, thick as the London fog that curled beyond the window panes. So they were never truly innocent, Doyle murmured, more to himself than to her. Eliza exhaled softly, reaching for her cup of tea with deliberate grace. They were aware, she confirmed, her tone measured. They knew the flat was a conduit for illicit dealings, but they didn't know exactly who was behind it. Their performance of naivety was their greatest weapon. She took a sip, the steam ghosting against her lips. And an effective one, I must say. Doyle's jaw tightened. Then why not tell us? We could have worked together. Eliza tilted her head slightly, her expression almost amused, because, dear Doyle, their mission was not to be seen, not even by us. Exposure would have put everything at risk. Their purpose was to keep the flat looking ordinary, lived in, unremarkable. A quiet couple in a quiet residence, the perfect camouflage. Doyle leaned back, crossing his arms. So in the end, they let us do the heavy lifting, not entirely. Eliza's gaze sharpened. They were gathering intelligence in their own way, but yes, our interference certainly expedited matters. Their role was to be the safeguard, in case things took an unfortunate turn. A silence stretched between them, the weight of unspoken thoughts pressing against the dimly lit room. Doyle ran a hand through his hair, exhaling through his nose. And what do you think of them now? For the first time that night, a flicker of something almost resembling warmth touched Eliza's expression. I respect their dedication, she admitted. But trust, no. Deception, no matter how noble the cause, leaves behind too many unanswered questions. She set down her cup with a soft clink. We may never know the full extent of their involvement, or who exactly they answer to. As if on cue, a sharp knock echoed against the door. Doyle shot Eliza a glance before rising to answer. A single envelope lay on the doorstep, pale against the dark wood. No messenger, no footsteps fading into the night. Just the quiet certainty that it had been placed there only moments ago. Doyle returned to his seat, sliding the envelope across the table. Eliza unfolded it with practiced ease, her eyes scanning the neatly penned words. A hint of a smile ghosted her lips, but the gleam in her gaze was unreadable. A note from the Robinsons, she murmured, holding it out. Doyle took it, frowning as he read aloud. Our thanks for your unwitting assistance. Rest assured, the plans are now in the right hands. He lowered the paper, brow furrowed. That's all? No explanation, no apology, none. Eliza folded her hands in her lap, unbothered. But then we should have expected no less. Doyle let out a sharp breath, shaking his head. So that's it then. They disappear, the case closes, and we're left with more questions than answers. Eliza's smile was faint, but knowing, quite. The fire crackled in the quiet, its glow flickering against the walls. Doyle frowned at the letter in his hands, but Eliza merely gazed into the embers, her mind already a step ahead. In mysteries, as in life, not all answers come neatly wrapped. The world thrived on deception, shifting lines between hero and villain, truth and illusion, and those who thought they had unraveled the game were often just another pawn upon the board.